All right. Hey, everybody, and welcome to our penultimate week of Beer Judge training. And tonight we are going to be talking about strong Belgian ale and Trappist ale. As a reminder, for those of you who have questions, please remember that we have our Google form where you can submit questions for next week's review. And as always, as you have questions, feel free to send them along to me. But you are also more than welcome to submit those via the form so we can talk about them next week during the review session. And of course, if you would like to ask the questions live during the review session, you're more than welcome to do that. And I will get my wits about me shortly, hopefully before we get into these slides. So as you have questions tonight, as we're talking through the slides, feel free to pop those into the Q&A. And I'll take a couple of breaks in between talking about the styles to keep an eye on those so we can get those answered for you. So let's get started. With our strong Belgian ale and Trappist ale. So tonight we're going to be talking about Belgian blonde ale, Saison, and Belgian golden strong ale. Then we're going to move into the Trappist ale category and talk about Trappist single, Belgian double, Belgian triple, and Belgian dark strong ale. These are all really fun beers. I always love talking about Belgian beers. I really love drinking Belgian beers. So we're used to this screen. These are our BJCP score sheets. Two of the most common variations you're going to see. Of course, when you come in for your exam, you're going to have the exam score sheet, so you won't have the benefit of those off-flavor descriptors that you'll have on a competition score sheet, but everything else is going to remain the same. So when we're talking about strong Belgian ale, this is again one of those kind of catch-all categories where they are grouped together by really the most tenuous relationships. So with strong Belgian ale, what we're talking about is these are going to be beers that are going to be strong, well attenuated, balanced to bitter beers. So you'll recall last week we talked about European sour beer and the Belgian ales, most of which were, or actually, I'm sorry, this European sour beers were mostly Belgian style beers. So we're shifting now into out of the acidic sorts of beers of Belgium into the, again, the beers that aren't necessarily sour and the beers that aren't Trappist, and they landed in the strong Belgian ale. So these are going to be driven by yeast character rather than malt flavors, and they're generally going to be higher in alcohol, although a range exists within styles. That really a range only exists in one style, and that's Saison, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So we're going to start with Belgian Blonde Ale. And Belgian Blonde Ale is a moderate strength golden ale that has a subtle, fruity, spicy Belgian yeast complexity, slightly malty, sweet flavor, and dry finish. And Belgian Blonde, we've seen this with American ales, with English ales, and Belgian Blonde Ale functions in a similar way that a Belgian Pale Ale does, where Belgian Blonde Ale specifically was created to compete with macro lagers, which is still about, I think it's like 95% of what the world population is drinking at any given time. So Belgian Blonde Ale is kind of the Belgian answer, similar to an American Blonde Ale or a British Golden Ale, Australian Sparkling Ale. And one thing I will note is a little pedantic, but when we're talking about a Belgian Blonde Ale, there's not an E at the end. When you're talking about a blonde ale from America or from the United States, there is an E on the end. That's pedantic, and I'm sure it would never cost anybody points, but I do like to point out that the Belgians don't spell blonde with an E. So in true Belgian style, even though this was created to compete with macro lagers, to kind of win over lager drinkers, it's fairly high ABV for if we're comparing it to something like a macro lager. So it's going to be about 6 to 7.5%. So it's got some strength to it, considering the kind of the market that they're going after with that. And, you know, one thing definitely about Belgian brewers, I know we've talked about it on a few of these sessions, is the guidelines, things like BJCP guidelines, Brewers Association guidelines, are not solely a United States thing, but you know, pretty much. And so if you go to Belgium, they really don't get tied up in beer styles. So you will see oftentimes there is a blonde, a brune, which is brown. Sometimes you may see an amber. But if you say went to Belgium and asked for a Belgian blonde ale, that's a distinction that may not click with whoever it is you're speaking to. So one that's kind of an important thing to keep in mind when we're talking about Belgian beers is organizations like the BJCP have shoehorned Belgian beers into categories that make the most sense for the most beer styles. And that's certainly not a fault of trying to categorize them where they most make sense. Just be aware that there are a lot of other beer styles and beer types, particularly someplace like Belgium, that aren't necessarily reflected in the style guidelines. But Belgian blonde ale is. So when we're talking about the aroma, we're going to expect a lightly grainy, sweet malt character. Hops are going to be light earth or spicy. Belgian hops typically will be spicy in character or earthy, sometimes herbal. They're going to be, hops aren't necessarily the focus of most Belgian beers. So hops are kind of a necessary, you know, they're there to do the job of being a preservative, providing bitterness, but you don't typically expect to find a ton of hop forward character in a Belgian beer, in a Belgian brewed beer. So our fermentation characteristics, we're going to have a subtle yeast character that may include spicy phenolics, perfumey or honey-like alcohol, or yeasty, fruity esters. Those are commonly going to be orange-like or lemony. And we'll see with a lot of the Belgian blonder beers, they are going to have those fruity yeast esters are typically going to come across as orange or lemony. And you may also recall when we were talking about British beers that a lot of British hops will have kind of a marmalade flavor, but you'll still see that written as, you know, as orange flavor. With Belgian characters, when you're seeing orange as frequently as an ester, that's going to be more of a like a navel orange, you know, an orange as the actual fruit rather than a product made from oranges. Our color is going to be light to deep gold. It is a blonde ale, after all, generally very clear. It's going to have good head retention. We would expect our head to be white to off-white. And one thing that's going to be, you'll see throughout with most of the Belgian blonde ales that aren't mixed fermentations, that aren't a sour beer, is they're going to have this large, dense, creamy head. When you've got a beer in front of you that is purporting to be a Belgian blonde, a Belgian golden strong, a Belgian triple, that head, the head texture and the volume of it is going to be a good indication of whether you do actually have a Belgian beer in front of you. So for the flavor, this is going to look a lot like the aroma does. So for malt, we would expect light to moderate grainy sweet. You may also see lightly caramelized sugar or honey-like sweetness on the palate. And with the lightly caramelized sugar, we'll talk about this also when we get to Belgian triples, but Westmalle is one of the Trappist breweries that we'll talk about in a moment. And they used to have I believe it was a direct fired boil kettle. So when you were running off from the lauter into the boil kettle, you may get a little bit of caramelization from the wort, you know, our sugar water that is on the bottom of the kettle, caramelizing ever so slightly. So that light caramelized sugar or honey-like sweetness is really going to be, you may have that. You shouldn't necessarily expect that in every Belgian blonde. And we have talked at length about paying attention to the some, you know, may, should, must, never. that kind of language. So you may have some of that lightly caramelized sugar, but it's not a fault if it's not there. So our hop bitterness is going to be medium, and our hop flavor is going to be spicy or earthy. And when we're talking about Belgian beers, really what we're going to be talking about is the fermentation characteristics and those yeast profiles that they create. Belgian beers are very much yeast driven and yeast forward. So we would expect a very soft yeast character, so esters and alcohols, which are sometimes perfumey or orange or lemon-like, and light spicy phenolics are optional. I actually had a Left blonde a couple of weeks ago. That's one of the commercial examples. It's also the commercial example that you can find most available in the United States. And it had such a high clove phenolic that it never even occurred to me that it was a blind. I was doing a blind tasting. It never even occurred to me that this could possibly be a Belgian blonde ale because the spicy phenolics were so high. And I've actually never had a Left like that. And I don't know if I'll ever have one again. So our finish is going to be medium dry to dry with some smooth alcohol becoming evident in the aftertaste. The body is going to be medium. The carbonation is going to be medium high to high. And our warmth is going to be light to moderate, but we should still expect it to be smooth. And you'll see that, kind of the vague, ambiguous, smooth term throughout with the Belgian beers as well. And you may have some creaminess to it. So then next we'll move on to Saison, and entire books have been written about Saison. I remembered to grab 2 books to reference for you tonight, and I neglected to grab the one that focuses on Saison. So understand that what we're talking through here for the next 5 minutes or so is very, very, very high level. Saison is really a fascinating beer style, and there's a ton written about it. So keep that in mind. This is one of those styles that if you would like to learn more about it, you can go down a really deep rabbit hole on it. So Saison is also going to be similar to Bière de Garde that we talked about last week, where it's very much a farmhouse beer. So it's one of the things that makes it so fascinating is that it has all these different interpretations, because you may recall from last week when we briefly discussed farmhouse beers, farmhouse really means that you're brewing with what you have available, whatever raw ingredients you have available. And sometimes that can be spelt, it can be buckwheat, it could be rye, really anything. So Saison, most commonly a pale, refreshing, highly attenuated, moderately bitter, moderate strength Belgian ale with a very dry finish. And that very dry finish is one of the hallmarks of a Saison. So if you're doing something like a tasting exam or a Cicerone exam and you're being asked, is this a Saison? Pay attention to the finish, because if the finish is not very dry, then it's not going to be a good example of a Saison. And then the other thing I'll point out on this slide is that Saison is a beer that has varying ABV ranges and varying SRM ranges. So when we're talking about Saisons, we have table, standard, and super strength. Table is going to be 3.5 to 5%. Standard will be 5 to 7. Super will be 7 to 9.5. Now, this isn't something that it's good to know if you're a home brewer or a professional brewer and you're entering competitions. This is a very good thing to pay attention to, because I have certainly left feedback when I'm judging Saisons if somebody did not denote that it was a standard strength Saison. In my feedback, I would say I judge this as if it were, then, based on my context clues where I thought it fit in with Saison, but make sure to denote what kind of Saison it is that you are entering. And excuse me, that is, again, I would say, and generally in my experience with judging Saisons, if somebody doesn't tell you what it is, you can assume pale standard strength. If you're getting, if it seems very, if it's dark or if it's very high in alcohol, then it may be a super Saison, it may be a dark Saison. and just make sure to leave that as feedback on the score sheet of, hey, make sure that you're telling me what it is precisely, because within the guidelines, it does say, you should say what the ABV range and what the color is of your Saison. Typically, I'm not going to dock somebody a ton of points for that. It's kind of like when you get a beer, if it's a low fill, or for some reason it still has a label on it or something like that. It's really more than anything just a, hey, here's a heads up, this isn't proper. But I wouldn't necessarily like take away 5 points or something like that. So the other part to point out with Saison is that Saison can be a pale Saison or a dark Saison. So our pale Saison is going to be a 5 to 14. So that's about a deep gold to maybe an amber, deeper amber, kind of approaching copper. Dark is going to be copper to brown, and really more of a true brown. You're kind of getting into dark brown territory there. But it shouldn't look like a stout or anything like that. So for Saison, for the malt aroma, it's going to be typically slightly grainy in character and low in intensity. Again, with Saison, this is going to be a very yeast-driven beer. Darker and stronger versions will have more noticeable malt, which makes sense, right? As we're adding darker malts to make the character darker, we're also going to get darker flavors. So toasty, biscuity, caramelly, chocolate, etc. Our hops are going to be low to moderate. They can be spicy, floral, earthy, or fruity. And our fermentation characteristics, moderate to high esters. These are often going to be reminiscent of citrus fruits, such as oranges or lemons, and moderately strong peppery phenols. So I've also heard people talk about Saison's spiciness, and that is, again, that's going to be a hallmark of the beer. And with the esters, for me, for something like a Saison DuPont, it often comes across to me as oranges. So it's that orange or lemon is going to be, should be fairly easy to pick out in the ester profile. So then our colors, the pale version is often a distinctive pale orange, but it may be pale golden to amber in color. And then darker versions may run from copper to dark brown. Clarity is going to be poor to good, but is always going to be effervescent. And that high carbonation is another hallmark of Belgian beers. For most Belgian beers, not including things like lambics, you would expect to see a lot of carbonation. You would expect for them to be effervescent. The head retention is going to be long lasting. That head texture, dense and rocky. The head color is going to be white to ivory. And again, something like a Saison will have just a magnificent head on it, and it will have really good head retention. That's also has proven to be a challenge sometimes for things like beer competitions. If you've got a lot of Saisons that are made to style, or like a Belgian Golden Strong Ale, you get these huge rocky heads, which when you're trying to pour 2 ounces at a time for people, means that it takes a little bit longer to get all of those samples poured and brought out for the judges. So our flavors, the malt flavor is going to be low to medium soft, often with some graininess. Darker versions, again, will have more of those darker malt flavors, such as toasty, bready, biscuity, chocolate. But they are going to be there to support these characteristics of the beer, particularly the fermentation characteristics. So you wouldn't expect a very malt forward Saison. And then roasted flavors are not typical. So this is another fine point that when you're judging Saison, if you get a beer where you get some roasted flavors, it doesn't necessarily say that it's incorrect. It says that it's not typical. So it's atypical, not incorrect. And if that was something that was, a beer that was on your table, that would just be a conversation with your fellow judges to decide how you want to interpret it, but it's not a flaw. Hop bitterness is going to be moderate to high. Hop flavor is going to be low to moderate, earthy, or spicy. Our fermentation characteristics, medium low to medium high, fruity and spicy flavors. So these are going to be very similar to what you got in the aroma. And that's going to be the oranges, lemons, the pepperiness. And when we're talking about peppers, for me, it comes across a lot of times as a white pepper, sometimes a black pepper, but we are talking about, like salt and pepper, that kind of pepper that you will get in your Saison. The balance is going to be towards the fruity, spicy, hoppy character with any bitterness or sourness, not overwhelming these flavors. So this is also when I'm trying to make these slides and kind of keep everything consistent, some Saisons may have acidity to them. That's not, that again is an interpretation of the style. So it doesn't have to be there. If it is there, it's not a fault. So I highly encourage you, if you haven't already, make sure you're reading through the guidelines and pay close attention to that part about within the Saison, about when and how sourness may present itself. The attenuation is extremely high. So again, that high attenuation means that we're not going to have very many sugars left in the finished product, right? So it's going to be very, very dry. That is essential. The Saison should never finish sweet. So if you have a Saison on your table and it finishes sweet, that is a flaw. That is really a very big flaw. So if you have a Saison finishing sweet, that would be something that, you know, would be like, okay, this is already like you're knocked down kind of to the bottom of the pack because you're missing a fundamental part of the style. It would be kind of like if you had an American IPA and it didn't have any hop aroma or flavor, then it's not that, right? It's not a very good version of that. The mouthfeel is going to be light to medium. Carbonation, very high, again, with that effervescent quality. The warmth will vary with strength. So if we have something like a table beer that's going to be about maybe 3.5%, 4%, we wouldn't expect to get alcohol warmth. If we've got something like a super strength Saison that's 9%, we would expect a little bit of alcohol warmth there. And other palate sensations, there should be enough prickly acidity on the tongue to balance that very dry finish. So it will still be a very refreshing beer. So the next we have Belgian Golden Strong Ale. This is a complex, pale, effervescent, strong Belgian style ale that is highly attenuated and features fruity and hoppy notes in preference to phenolics. And we'll talk about Belgian triple in a few moments. I actually did a blind side by side. No, it was not blind. I did not want to do that to my ego. I knew which one was which, but I had a Saison, Belgian Golden Strong, and a triple side by side and went through and tasted them after I had read through the styles and made notes about a Belgian Golden Strong will have less of a emphasis on phenolics, whereas a triple will have a little bit more and a Saison will have a little bit more than that. And I had done that because earlier in the week during a blind tasting, I had written down a Saison when it was in fact a Belgian triple. So I made a note to go back and reflect on when each one of those would be, would be acceptable, and kind of walk myself through and then did the side by side. So I say all that to say that if you're a Belgian Golden Strong Ale and a Belgian triple and even a Saison, there is a lot of overlap. This is not something you would get asked on your BJCP tasting exam or your certified Cicerone exam. It's really not even something you probably get asked on something like the advanced Cicerone exam, because it's slicing the hair so thin on what the differences are between each one of the beers. So don't worry about that cautionary tale. That's not something that you're going to have to worry about. So the commercial examples, I don't typically go over these, but one thing I will point out is that you may notice looking through, we have Duvel, we have Judas, we have Lucifer. If you see a beer that seems like it's named after the devil, then it's probably a Belgian Golden Strong Ale. So we've talked about naming conventions a couple of times throughout our training, and this is another one of these. Delirium Tremens is one of the exceptions, but the Duvel was the first, the style maker for this category. Belgian Golden Strong Ale came from Duvel. Duvel existed before this category existed. And Judas, Pirat, Lucifer all came afterwards, and people adopted that convention of naming their Belgian Golden Strong Ale after the devil. So if you see a devil reference, it's more than likely a Belgian Golden Strong Ale, or it's somebody being a jerk and bucking traditions and just confusing people. So with Belgian Golden Strong, our malt character is going to be light and slightly grainy sweet, but it can also be nearly neutral. Hops are going to be low to moderate, yet distinctive, perfumey, floral hop character is often present. And for me, the that perfumey floral hop character is one of those kind of telltale signs that I'm learning about to be able to distinguish, like, okay, if I know if I'm getting something that is floral on this beer that I've kind of deduced already is some sort of a pale Belgian ale, that perfumey floral hop is going to give me a very good indication that I have a Belgian Golden Strong in front of me. Our fermentation characteristics. The moderate esters are reminiscent of lighter fruits such as pears, oranges, or apples. So that can be another good indication and also a difference between a Belgian Golden Strong and a Saison. So you're going to get more of the pear. You may also get oranges, but you may also get apples. For me, typically it shows up as pears or apples. I rarely get orange from a Belgian Golden Strong. Your results may differ. The phenols are going to be moderate to moderately low, spicy, and peppery. Alcohols will be soft, spicy, perfumey, low to moderate in intensity. This is one of those beers that can be upwards of 10.5%. And it's so you would expect in beers like that to have some sort of alcohol presence in the aroma. The color is going to be yellow to medium gold, good clarity, long lasting, white head, massive, and rocky. So we're seeing a pattern in what our Belgian pale beers are going to look like. So for the flavor, this is another one of those styles where the BJCP guidelines don't even address malt, but the malt will be, again, it can be neutral to fairly grainy. So you wouldn't expect to get a ton of malt flavor in a Belgian Golden Strong. Our hop bitterness is going to be medium to high, and our hop flavor is going to be low to moderate spicy. So our fermentation characteristics, the esters are going to be reminiscent of pears, oranges, or apples, and we're going to have those low to moderately low phenols that are going to be peppery. And again, when we're talking about peppery, we're talking about black pepper, white pepper. Those are really the only two peppers I can think of right now. A lot of times you may also see something like a peppercorn. That is still a pepper that's, no, never mind, scratch that, because if you have a peppercorn flavor, it's probably from added peppercorns, not from the yeast. So our finish is going to be, we should expect that substantial carbonation and bitterness to lead to a dry finish with a low to moderate bitter aftertaste. Alcohols, again, soft and spicy, low to moderate in intensity. Body is going to be light to medium, very high carbonation and very effervescent. A smooth but noticeable alcohol warmth, no hot alcohol solventy character. And another thing about Belgian Golden Strong ales is in Belgian brewing, frequently they use candy sugar, brewing sugars, and adding those sugars has the effect of the yeast eating all of that fermentable sugar. You're going to have a very dry finish because the yeast has eaten all of that sugar. But what the yeast has also done when it's eaten all of that sugar is it's produced more ethanol. So a well-made Belgian Golden Strong, Belgian Triple, those are going to be higher in alcohol and they're not going to taste like it. And that sugar has also had the effect of thinning out the body. So it's going to be very light bodied. So they can be deceivingly dangerous. At least the good examples of them are. So we're going to move into Trappist ale. I'm going to get a drink of kombucha really quickly. If you have any questions, pop them into the Q&A. And we will move on. Let me make sure I'm not, okay. We will move on to Trappist ale. So Trappist is a protected legal appellation. So that's just like Kolsch, when we talked about Kolsch and the Kolsch Convention. It cannot be used commercially except by genuine Trappist monasteries that brew their own beer. So I neglected to put a slide in here on that, but let's talk briefly about the difference between Trappist beers and Abbey beers. And this is really what this section of the BJCP guidelines is talking about. If you're doing something like studying for one of your Cicerone exams, you will need to know this distinction. I don't believe you will need to know it for your BJCP, at least for the online exam. But in case you do, now you have the information as well. So there is an authentic Trappist product. It is there's a certifying body for it. If you're an authentic Trappist product, you can put that label on whatever it is you're making. So that can apply to beer, it can apply to cheese. I think there's wine also. If you are a Trappist monastery, then you are able to have that label. And so with Trappist beers, these are going to be beers that are brewed at the monastery, for the monastery, on monastery grounds, under supervision of monks. That doesn't mean that the monks have to be brewing the beer, although in a lot of cases they are, but you have to meet those designations. So we will talk about, or I have listed in here, two breweries that are a great example of that, and that is West Fletiron and St. Bernardus. So West Fletiron is a Trappist brewery. St. Bernardus is not. So it's considered an abbey brewery because it's secular brewer. It's not brewing undertaken by monks. It's not carried out on monastic grounds, but they are very, very close to each other. And for a long time, St. Bernardus was brewing a lot of West Fletiron's beer for them until we have this Trappist designation. And at that point, they had to kind of split part ways, and West Fletiron started brewing its own beer, but they still use St. Bernardus yeast. So St. Bernardus still supplies West Fletiron with their yeast. Westmalle is another Trappist brewery that supplies several other Trappist breweries with their yeast. But that's, I'm going down kind of a long rabbit hole between Trappist and Abbey. Abbey is a Trappist style beer that is not brewed on monastic property. That's secular brewers. So if, let's say, I'm a brewery, I want to brew a Belgian double, I cannot call it a Trappist ale legally. But I could say this is an Abbey ale, or this is an Abbey style ale. But for the BJCP purposes, they leave us with, this is a legal appellation. In this instance, they're using it to describe the the type or styles of beer produced by those breweries and those who make beers of a similar style. So again, it's will probably be helpful to know some of the main Trappist breweries. But for tasting purposes, they're really just like normal brewery. I shouldn't say normal, just like secular breweries all over the world. Your brewery is going to have its own flavors and have its own distinct style, but there's not, I can brew a Belgian double and it will be similar to a Belgian double brewed at a Trappist monastery. I give myself a lot of credit. It would not taste anything like something brewed at a Trappist monastery, but I could do it and I could call it an Abbey ale. So Trappist type beers are all characterized by very high attenuation, high carbonation through bottle conditioning, and interesting and often aggressive yeast character. So again, we've got high carbonation, we have high attenuation, which means it's going to be very dry, and we're going to have that yeast-driven character. So Trappist single, this one is a really interesting one because you really don't see it brewed commercially very often. And even within Belgium, a Trappist single is usually a beer that's kept on monastic property for the monks. So you don't always see it out and about in the world. It's going to be a pale, bitter, highly attenuated, and well-carbonated Trappist ale, showing a fruity, spicy Trappist yeast character, a spicy floral hop profile, and a soft, supportive, grainy, sweet malt palate. And in this moment, I'm thinking I really need to try to find a Trappist single and taste that next to a Belgian blonde ale and see what the differences are between the two because they sound very similar. So for aroma, we would expect our malt to be low to medium low, grainy sweet. It's going to be, again, like most of our Belgian beers we're talking about tonight, it's going to be there to support the other flavors, particularly the fermentation flavors. You may have a light honey or sugar quality. Again, somebody like Westmalle that has just a teensy bit of kettle caramelization, that's where you would expect to see some of that, that kind of caramelized honey or sugar quality. Medium low to medium spicy or floral hops, and our fermentation characteristics, are going to be medium low to medium high Trappist yeast character, showing a fruity, spicy character. Bubblegum is inappropriate. And that's, bubblegum is going to be the flavor that you would get from something like Hefeweizen, or if you have a beer that's fermented at a very high temperature, it can also create some of those bubblegum fake banana flavors. In a Trappist single, it's going to be inappropriate. The color is going to be pale yellow to medium gold, generally good clarity, persistent head, and is going to be a white head with billowy, it's going to be billowy with characteristic lacing. So another thing that you'll see throughout the guidelines is this mention of Belgian lace, characteristic Belgian lace. And that is going to be as you've got, these big billowy heads, as they start to recede a little bit, you'll see the lace on the inside of the glass. So our flavor is going to be an initial malty sweet impression with a grainy, sweet, soft palate. It may have a light honeyed biscuit or cracker impression, but it's still going to be a very light malt character. You wouldn't expect a ton of malt character from a Trappist single. Our bitterness is going to be medium, and I will correct this that is missing on here somehow, but I will make sure to pop that in there. Flavor is going to be moderate, spicy, or floral. So with our esters, they're going to be citrus. So when we're talking about citrus, orange, lemon, grapefruit, we can expect apple or pear, or stone fruit such as apricot or peach. So really there's, there's a lot of flavors, but they're really all kind of in that same sort of window. They're all going to be very similar. And then we would expect light to moderate, spicy, peppery, or clove phenolics, because again, we're talking about a beer that's going to be very yeast driven. So we're going to expect to have more esters and phenols, more so really than any of the beers we've talked about up until this point. The finish is going to be crisp and dry with an aftertaste of light malt, moderate hops, and yeast characters. Our body is going to be medium light to medium, and the carbonation is going to be medium high to high. It can be somewhat prickly, and the warmth should not be noticeable because, again, this is more of a table beer for monks. Again, it's a beer that typically stays within the monastery walls. It's designed to be like moderate ABV, so something that you can drink and not get monk wasted, I guess. So then the next one we'll talk about is Belgian Double. This is going to be a deep reddish copper, moderately strong, malty, complex Trappist ale with rich malty flavors, dark or dried fruit esters, and light alcohol blended together in a malty presentation that still finishes fairly dry. So we used malty a lot in that description. That should let you know this is one of those Belgian styles that's going to be more malt forward, but you are still going to expect to have those fermentation characteristics. So our malt is going to be complex, rich, sweet. You might have hints of chocolate, caramel, and or toast. I tend to get more of the caramel and toast flavors in a lot of Belgian doubles, but you should never have roasted or burnt flavors. So Belgian brewers get those more complex Maillard reactions and caramelization flavors from doing different mashing techniques or having longer boils or using something like brewing sugars. They're not going to get the flavor and the color by using roasted malts. So our hops are going to be low to none. If they're present, they're going to be spicy, herbal, or floral, but they're typically not there. Moderate fruity esters, usually including raisins and plums, sometimes also dried cherries. Esters can sometimes include banana or apple. And again, it's going to be it is a malt driven beer, but we still have a lot of yeast esters and yeast characteristics that are going to present themselves as that darker fruit character and sometimes dried fruit character. So the phenols are going to be very low to moderately spicy, and you will also have higher alcohols. Those are common, and they may include light clove and spice, peppery, rose-like, and or perfumey notes. The color is going to be dark amber to copper. The clarity is going to be generally clear. We're going to have a long-lasting off-white head that is large, dense, and creamy. So again, if you have a beer in front of you, you're not sure what it is, and you have this very large, dense head or rocky head, that can be a very good indication that you have a Belgian beer in front of you. Malt for the flavor is going to be medium to medium full, rich and complex. We would again expect hints of chocolate, caramel, and or toast, never roasted or burnt characters. The bitterness is going to be medium low. Our hops, if they are there, are going to be very low, spicy, floral, or herbal, but again, is optional. You don't usually get a lot of hop character from a Belgian double. Moderate fruity esters include raisins and plums, sometimes also dried cherries. Esters can also sometimes include banana or apple. For me, with a Belgian double, it comes across oftentimes as plums and dried cherries. Very low to moderate spicy phenols, and we would also expect some alcohol, higher alcohol flavors. Those are going to include light clove and spice, peppery, rose-like, or perfuming notes. The balance is always going to be towards the malt, but the finish is still going to be moderately dry. Mouthfeel, our body is going to be medium full, medium high carbonation. The warmth should be low if it's there, and it should never be hot or solventy. And that is a good thing to point out when we're talking about beers like Belgian Double, where just a moment ago we were talking about the higher alcohols being common. Higher alcohols are not always fusel alcohols or solventy in their character. So you can have higher alcohol and get some of that rose-like, perfumey kind of note from alcohol and have it not be hot or solventy. So Belgian Triple is next, and this is a pale, somewhat spicy, dry, strong Trappist ale with a pleasant rounded malt flavor and firm bitterness. So Belgian Triple, I mean, if you really want to be tough on yourself, do a blind tasting with a variety of Belgian Triples and Belgian Golden Strong Ales. Just going into it, understand that that is incredibly tough to do because there's so much overlap between the two. But if you do it and you're successful, I want to hear about it. I have never once been successful at being able to pick out the difference between, you know, if I have like a lineup of 6, I can maybe get 2. So our aroma, the malt is going to be light with a soft, slightly grainy sweet or slightly honey-like impression. The hops are usually going to have a low distinctive spicy floral, sometimes perfumey hop character. And again, this, you know, thinking back to Belgian Golden Strong, you get the, those are almost always going to have a very characteristic perfumey floral flavor. With Belgian Triples, it can, but it doesn't have to, but it can. So that's one of the things that makes it difficult to distinguish between the two. Our fermentation characteristics, generous, spicy, peppery, and sometimes clove-like phenols. Esters are going to be reminiscent of citrus fruits, such as oranges. So that is something that a Belgian Triple and a Saison have in common, is that our esters are going to be more than likely coming across as oranges. It may sometimes have a slight banana character. And I have met brewers who like that banana character in their Belgian beers and will, you know, particularly select yeast strains that have a little bit of that banana flavor or, you know, kind of coax more banana flavor out. I mean, nobody has asked me, but I will offer my opinion of, I personally don't really care for that banana flavor in a Belgian beer because I associate a banana flavor like that with something like a Hefeweizen. But it is not incorrect. So if I got a Belgian Triple at my judging table that had a slight banana character to it, even though I don't personally care for it, I still wouldn't call that a flaw because it is acceptable if it's a small amount. Alcohols are going to be soft, spicy, and low in intensity. Our appearance, so our color is going to be deep yellow to deep gold, good clarity, long-lasting, white, creamy, and rocky head. So the malt is going to be grainy sweet. Again, this has more of a rounded malt flavor to it, but it's still going to be very much more about our yeast character than it is about the malt character. Our hop bitterness is going to be medium to high, and our hop flavor is going to be low to moderate spicy. Low to moderate esters, or pardon me, low to moderate phenols are peppery in character, and our low to moderate esters are going to be reminiscent of citrus fruits such as orange and sometimes lemon. Overwhelmingly, your Belgian Triple, the esters are going to be more orange. but it's not, again, it's not a fault if a triple comes across as having more of a lemon forward ester. Substantial carbonation and bitterness lends to a dry finish with a moderately bitter aftertaste with substantial spicy, fruity yeast character. Alcohols are going to be soft, spicy, and low in intensity. Our body, the body is going to be medium light to medium, again, high carbonation. And here's this note about the alcohol content is deceptive and has little to no obvious warming sensation. And if you've had a well-made Belgian triple or a well-made Belgian golden strong, again, they're pretty light bodied. That high carbonation is going to help, like, refresh your palate. And you're really not going to, or you shouldn't be able to taste the higher alcohol, but it's there, and you'll learn that it it is there. And Belgian triple, like most of our Belgian beers we're talking about tonight, is going to be always effervescent. So then the last beer we have to talk about tonight is the Belgian Dark Strong Ale. This will also, you may see it referred to as a Belgian quad or Belgian quadruple. I'm sure they mentioned somewhere why they went with a different kind of distinction here, but Belgian Dark Strong Ale, Belgian quad, Belgian quadruple, we're talking about the same beer. This is going to be a dark, complex, very strong Belgian ale with a delicious blend of malt richness, dark fruit flavors, and spicy elements. Complex, rich, smooth, and dangerous. And I typically won't include the entire overall impression on these slides, but anytime a beer is described as dangerous, like, you just have to include that description. So this is one of our higher ABV beers. We have four of our, actually, I guess technically 5 beers that can go, from 8% all the way up to 12%, and even a little bit beyond if we're talking about something like an Eisbock. But similar to what we just talked about with the Belgian triple, with the Belgian golden strong, the alcohol is going to be deceptive. So it's not going to be like, drinking a really boozy beer, at least it shouldn't be. So it'll definitely sneak up on you. So our malt is going to be rich and strong, can have a deep, bready, toasty quality, often with a deep caramel complexity, no dark or roast malt aroma. So again, Belgian brewers are getting those flavors by adjusting their mash techniques, by boiling for longer to develop those flavors. They're not getting that color and kind of those deeper flavors by using dark or roasted malt. Hops are not usually present, but if they are there, it's very low, spicy, floral, or herbal. For our fermentation characteristics, strong to moderately low fruity esters, including raisin, plum, dried cherry, fig, or prune. I know I typically will pick up the raisin, the fig, the prune, sometimes dried cherry. Spicy phenols may be present, but usually have a peppery quality. They're not going to be clove-like, and you might also have a light vanilla character possible. Since, again, we're talking about a higher ABV beer, light to moderate alcohols will be there. They're going to be soft, spicy, perfumey, or rose-like. Our appearance is going to be deep amber to deep coppery brown, clear to somewhat hazy. Persistent head is going to be cream to light tan in color, and our head texture, again, is going to be huge, dense, and moussey. So then we're talking about flavor. This is going to be similar again to our aroma. Moderate, malty, rich. It can have a deep, bready, toasty quality. It will also often have a deep caramel complexity to it. Again, no dark roast or no dark or roasted malt. The bitterness is going to be medium, low to moderate. The hop flavor will not usually be present. If it is there, it's going to be very low, spicy, floral, or herbal. Again, that's acceptable if you have a beer in front of you that's a Belgian dark strong that you're wondering if the hop flavor is too high. It probably is, because you don't typically expect to find hop flavor in a Belgian dark strong ale. Strong to moderately low fruity esters, including raisin, plum, dried cherry, fig, or prune notes. The spicy phenols may be present. They usually have a peppery quality, not clove-like. And again, you might also have a little bit of light vanilla. Low to moderate alcohols are soft, spicy, perfumey, and or rose-like. The balance is generally going to be malty rich, but it can be fairly even in terms of the balance between the maltiness and the bitterness. The aftertaste is going to be usually moderately dry to dry, although it may be up to moderately sweet. So our body is going to be medium light to medium full, high carbonation. Our warmth is going to be smooth, but noticeable. And again, it should be smooth. You would expect to get a little bit of alcohol warmth in a 12% beer, but it shouldn't, noticeable isn't the same thing as hot or solventy. So that is the end of what I have for you all tonight. If you have any questions, please put it in the Q&A, and we can take a couple of minutes to talk through those. And as a reminder, this is actually our very last judging session where we're just focused on a particular set of beer styles. So next week is going to be our review. And again, any questions you have from weeks 7 through weeks 13, please submit those, keep a list, come ready next week to ask some questions, talk through anything that you would like to talk to. Of course, I remain available to all of you when this is over, so you're always free to reach out with questions. But with the review session next week, we have an hour and a half. We can talk through whatever you would like to talk through. So with Belgian beers, the last thing I'll end on, I neglected to grab my Farmhouse Ales book, but that is another book by the Brewers Publications that is fantastic. It has an essay on there that's really considered the definitive history of Saison. So Farmhouse Ales, great book. I don't have it here to show you. Brew Like a Monk by Stan Hieronymus. This is an absolutely fantastic book that goes through in depth Trappist beers, all of the styles we talked about. It talks about each one of the Trappist monasteries in Belgium, which all have, fascinating histories and cool stories to tell. The other book I would recommend, if you can find it, is The Great Beers of Belgium by Michael Jackson. The Beer Hunter, and Michael Jackson is was such a talented writer. He's one of those authors that I had heard that he was a great author, but didn't really understand how good until I started reading his books, and it really is phenomenal. If ever you find your interest or your motivation in beer waning, pick up something by Michael Jackson and it will reinvigorate that motivation and passion for you. But he speaks with the Great Beers of Belgium. As a travel writer, he shares a lot of personal experiences, a lot of being able to, meet with and talk to and go behind the scenes of all of these places. But the Great Beers of Belgium is just such a good book. It's such an entertaining book. So if, reading through these styles, one of them really piques your interest, or you're interested in learning more about Belgian brewing, about his, beer in Belgium is intertwined with Belgian culture. Those are great books to get you started down that road. So with that, I'm not seeing any questions. So we will wrap up a little bit early tonight and make sure that, again, any questions you have for a review session, let me know. Use the Google form. You can email them to me, or you can just make a list and come ready to talk about them next week. So thank you everyone for joining me tonight. And I hope you all have a great week, and we will see you back here next week for our very final Beer Judge training.